Forward, the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. Winston Churchill, speech at Harvard University, September 6, 1943. This book is intended to fill a signal absence in the literature on the Illuminati, namely, the light seekers/light-bearers, in general, and the Illuminist movements that have emerged in the history of esotericism, in particular. Scanning the titles published on the subject of illumination over the past several decades, and those scheduled as forthcoming titles, one is startled by how significantly under-researched this issue is, and by the lack of a unified, systematic study of the issue of illumination in its entirety. Moreover, what a tangle one finds when reading over the available literature, including internet publications, on Illuminist movements, especially the 18th century Illuminati of Bavaria, and, generally, on esotericism and its relationship with metaphysics. By contrast, the purpose of this book is to refocus the discussion on illumination and the various Illuminati and to restore an important context for understanding the terms. That context, taken for granted for a long time, must be reconsidered from a new perspective. The argument of this book is that illumination and the Illuminati as descriptors become intellectually incoherent and even objects of arbitrary speculation if we do not recognize and acknowledge their spiritual history and context in its entirety. It goes without saying that, oddly enough, there are few terms more anathematized than Illuminati. It is not uncommon to find the word used for denigration, as when members of the political, economic, and cultural elites are condemned because they are assumed to be Illuminati, or when especially after the publication of best-selling novels and conspiracy theory books about the historical Illuminati of Bavaria, as several scholars make the word synonymous with woolly-mindedness, and several pseudo-esotericists use the word in order to speculate on people's ignorance, imagination, and curiosity. By creating pseudo-Illuminati organizations and undercurrent associations. Point 1. Moreover, in several contemporary and older 1 Gil, what is the Illuminati? 12 forward religious publications. Not only does one find relatively few scholarly rigorous publications on the topic, but one also realizes that often the notion of a light-bearer is associated with evil archetypes, often given the names of Lucifer and Satan, and one might wonder why that is. A. From information to illumination. Information consists of the facts, the raw data, and their communication, as well as the potential interpretation that can be given to these facts. By the term interpretation, we mean the assignment of meaning to data. Therefore, information can be defined as data, cognitive stimuli, as content, sensuous and conceptual/abstract objects of conscious processing, and as a message, an event of communication/exchange of data, to which a meaning can be assigned and from which knowledge can be acquired. At the most basic level, information refers to the difference or the distinction between two states, and this difference or distinction underpins the acquisition of knowledge by the conscious being that receives the corresponding information. Consequently, the acquisition of knowledge represents a difference or a distinction too, for which reason the cyberneticist Gregory Bateson has argued that information is a difference which makes a difference. 2. However, the aforementioned difference does not necessarily lead to knowledge, but it has the potential to do so, and, therefore, it would be more accurate to argue that information is a difference which is capable of making a difference. Furthermore, it is not difference qua difference that can make a difference, namely, lead to knowledge, but it is a meaningful difference, namely, an adequately interpreted difference, that can make a difference. As a result, information is a meaningful or adequately interpreted difference that can make a difference. But what exactly does being meaningful mean? A being or a thing is defined to be meaningful if it is related to something that transcends the given being or thing. Hence, a conscious being concerned with the issue of meaning naturally seeks the ultimate source of meaning, the primary meaning, or the meaning of meaning. In fact, this is the deity. If one assumes that the ultimate source of meaning is something other than God, then one is ultimately obliged to argue that imagination is the ultimate source of meaning. But, in contrast to God, imagination cannot really create species ex nihilo, and, far from being self-sufficient, imagination must ultimately have recourse to reason in order to organize itself. And to 2 Bateson, Ecology of Mind, pages 315 to 17. The meaning of being Illuminati. 13. Be able to communicate with other imaginations. The knowledge of and the participation in the ultimate source of meaning is the essence of illumination. The current drift of contemporary scholarship, especially under the influence of an epistemologically and ontologically arrogant strand of thought that is known as scientism, is well away from an unfashionable subject like illumination, which essentially overlaps with metaphysics and mysticism. Hence, one finds considerable emphasis on the study of the inanimate nature and the material culture, and realizes that many contemporary scholars cannot easily appreciate questions of meaning, purpose, philosophical cosmology, or metaphysics. Instead, many choose to stay safely ensconced in a superficial positivism, which allows them to evade the entire field of traditional metaphysics and to constrain human thought to conventional truths, thus clearly separating truth from reality. Others proceed even further by proclaiming the dawn of a so-called post-truth era. Behind such perspectives is typically a self-complacent nihilism, specifically, a modern variant of nihilism that, in contrast to Nietzsche's tragic nihilism, celebrates and preaches a way of life without any concern about life's ultimate meaning and purpose. In fact, it is worth pointing out that the word nihilism comes from the Latin terms ne equals not, and hilum equals ahilum. Namely, it signifies uprooted, or spiritually hovering and disconnected people. However, a few decades ago, that was not the case. Then, mysticism was understood as the culmination and apex of religious experience. For instance, in the beginning of the 20th century, the American psychologist William James, the English Anglo-Catholic writer and pacifist Evelyn Underhill, the French intellectual René Guénon, the Italian intellectual Baron Julius Evola, the American Christian anarchists Peter Morin and Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement in the 1930s, and the French philosopher Simone Weil saw the mystical path of illumination as the immediate spiritual intuition of truth believed to transcend reason and to unite its partakers into a spiritual community wherein both the individuality and the sociality of the human soul are underpinned by the soul's link with God. In addition, it is important to mention that the renowned French mathematician René Thom, 1923 to 2002, who is the acknowledged father of catastrophe theory, 3 and 1-3 catastrophe theory, CT, is a mathematical theory whose fundamental theme is the classification of critical points of smooth functions. In other words, the goal of CT is to classify systems according to their behavior under perturbation. Thus, CT is a method whereby mathematicians describe and classify systems and events where significant qualitative changes of behavior in the system are caused by 14 Forward. The Fields Medal in 1958 has recognized and acknowledged the importance of metaphysics for the natural sciences by arguing as follows. Modern science has made the mistake of foregoing all ontology by reducing the criteria of truth to pragmatic success. True, pragmatic success is a source of pregnance and so of signification. But this is an immediate, purely local meaning. Pragmatism, in a way, is hardly more than the conceptualized form of a certain return to animal nature. Positivism battened on the fear of ontological involvement. But as soon as we recognize the existence of others and accept a dialogue with them, we are in fact ontologically involved. Why, then, should we not accept the entities suggested to us by language? Even though we would have to keep a check on abusive hypostasis, this seems the only way to bring a certain intelligibility to our environment. Only some realist metaphysics can give back meaning to this world of ours. Point 4. The quest for illumination, like it or not, has a long history, and it is inextricably linked to the very existence of the human being. In general, the term existence signifies the continuity of a being. Consciousness, as consciousness of existence, aims at the preservation of the existence of a given being under the best possible terms. Thus, a conscious being aims at preserving its existence and at improving its existential conditions. Therefore, the intentionality of consciousness operates as an impulse to participate in the world, since consciousness absorbs and assimilates the world, and as pure self-knowledge. These functions take place at 4 different levels, namely, instinct, experience, based on sense perception, intellect, based on logic or rule-based reasoning, and spirituality, based on illuminated, metalogical intuition. At the level of instinct, conscious activity is minimal, and existence reduces to the 2 basic instincts, namely, those of survival and reproduction. Instinct is a highly formalized behavioral code that reflects the logic of organic nature. At the level of experience, the intentionality of consciousness is expressed through the functioning of the senses. In fact, a sense is a psychological capacity that provides organisms with data for perception. The senses are oriented towards the external world, with which they connect existence. Experience is about the person finding oneself in some situation and being aware of it. At the level of intellect, reason plays an active role. Thus, a conscious being perceives and thinks in nonlinear perturbations, which are represented by control parameters on which the corresponding function depends. For more details, see Lao's Topics in Mathematical Analysis and Differential Geometry. For René Thom, Semiophysics, pages 218 to 20. The meaning of being Illuminati 15 ways, and it influences perception. At the level of intellect, illumination refers to a state in which humans maintain a high level of vigilance, in the sense that their functions of perception and thought are highly alert, and they can direct their attention to what they deliberately choose, and a low level of tension, in the sense that they can maintain a high level of inner peace and self-control. Moreover, at the level of intellect, consciousness processes sensuous data in a scientific way, and, therefore, it explains them and organizes them into systems. For instance, one of the senses is touch, or somatosensation, which is a perception that results from activation of neural receptors in the skin, the tongue, the throat, and the mucosa. But what does it really mean that we can touch something? Every time we touch something, we exchange force-carrying particles with it. This is the essence of touching. Specifically, let us consider two electrons. In essence, an electron is a circular standing wave. Electrons, being zero-dimensional, lack spatial extension, that is, they have practically zero volume, and, therefore, they interact with each other by exchanging photons. As two electrons move towards each other, a photon is passed from one to another, and it changes the momentum of both of them, thus pushing them off. Therefore, in contrast to the folk understanding of touch, when we say that electrons touch each other, we mean that they interact with each other by exchanging a photon. The photon is a quantum of light and the force carrier of the electromagnetic force. The electromagnetic force is the result of the fact that particles with an electric charge exchange photons with each other. Even though photons propagate magnetic fields, they cannot be seen, because they are virtual particles, namely, particles that cannot be directly detected and may not obey all of the laws that physicists force all real physical particles to adhere to. For instance, virtual particles do not necessarily need to obey the Einstein energy-momentum relation. In fact, it is not just electrostatic repulsion that prevents atoms from getting close, but it is primarily the Pauli exclusion principle that forces the electrons and the quarks that make up the atom to arrange in shells instead of sitting on top of each other. In other words, since our atom's electrons repel objects when they are approximately m(1/8 billionth of a meter) away from us, we technically never touch anything, but we can feel the force of the resistance. The previous example clarifies the difference between explaining touch at the level of experience, namely, empirically, and explaining touch at the level of intellect, namely, scientifically. Moreover, those who have achieved high levels of intellectual development through meditation and consciousness-expanding practices exhibit a remarkable difference in their gamma brainwaves, which are the 16 forward fastest of brainwaves, high frequency, and relate to simultaneous processing of information from various sources. Daniel Goleman, a research psychologist, lecturer, and science journalist who has reported on the brain and behavioral sciences for the New York Times for many years, has argued that most people get gamma brainwaves for a very short period of time when they solve a problem that they have been grappling with, even if it is something that has vexed them for months, but in the brain of very intellectually developed persons who have rich experience in meditation, gamma is a lasting state that they experience constantly. 5 in this case, the term meditation is used independently of any particular religious belief system, and it refers to a practice where one uses a technique such as mindfulness, or focusing one's mind on a particular object, thought, or activity, in order to train attention and awareness and achieve an intellectually clear and emotionally calm state. At the level of spirituality, the intentionality of human consciousness is expressed through contemplative or ecstatic illumination, which transcends the levels of instinct, sensory experience, and intellect. In particular, at the level of spirituality, which Plato calls noesis, intelligence, 6 not only has a conscious being achieved to distinguish appearance from reality, to impose the government of reason on one's emotions, and to develop a scientific consciousness, but one has also cleansed and cured one's soul, thus being psychologically open to a mystical, intuitive communication with the Absolute, or the good in itself. It is worth pointing out that, in the second and the third sections of his essay Life, Art, and Mysticism, 7 the renowned Dutch mathematician and philosopher L. E. J. Brouwer, 1881–1966, has recognized and acknowledged the importance of intuitive knowledge, in general, by distinguishing immanent truths, which are suggested by perception, from the transcendent truth, which is primarily approached by discriminating oneself from the sensuous world and breaking the cycle of fear and desire caused by our relationship with the sensuous world. Therefore, mysticism should not be confused with superstition or ignorance. Ignorance is mental darkness, and superstition is an attitude that consists of irrational fears and timidity with regard to faith. Hence, superstitious individuals try to hide their insecurity and flaws behind formalism and ritualism. In addition, at the level of spirituality, without succumbing to superstitions or illusions, one is deeply aware of the difference between the sacred and the profane. The sacred is the realm of Communion 5 Goldman and Davidson, Altered Traits. 6 Plato, Republic, 514a, 521b. 7 Brouwer, Life, Art, and Mysticism, pages 389 to 429. The meaning of being Illuminati 17 with the absolute, the good in itself, that is, the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence, whereas the profane is the realm of self-centeredness and materialism. The distinction between the sacred and the profane is intimately related to philosophy, theology, and several esoteric societies, such as those of the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the historical Illuminati, etc. The issues to which I hitherto referred in this foreword have determined both my scholarly endeavors and the initiatives that I have undertaken in the field of esoteric societies. Regarding my scholarly consciousness, I would like to mention that it has been primarily formed by my studies and research in mathematics and philosophy. In particular, at the Department of Mathematics of the University of La Verne, California, from which I graduated in 1996, I conducted research in mathematical logic, specifically in the algebra of valued logic and descriptive set theory, and in the foundations of mathematical analysis. During my studies and research at the University of La Verne, the renowned mathematician Professor Themistocles M. Rashes, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, London, supervised my mathematical research and thesis, which was published as the Volume 24 of the World Scientific Publishing Company series in Pure Mathematics, 1998. My research work in logic and mathematics helped me to appreciate the deep relationship between mathematical and philosophical method. In 1623, the renowned Italian astronomer, physicist, and engineer Galileo Galilei wrote in his essay Il Saggiatore, the Assayer, as translated by Thomas Salisbury. Philosophy is written in this grand book. I mean the universe which stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth. Point 8. Thus, according to Galileo, it is philosophy that is written in the language of mathematics. In the same spirit, Isaac Newton published his theories of Calculus 9 and celestial mechanics in a book entitled Mathematical 8, quoted in Burt, The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science, page 75. 9. Calculus consists of two fields, namely, differential calculus and integral calculus. Differential calculus is concerned with curves and slopes. The slope of a curve is defined as rise over run and is referred to as the derivative of a function. Integral calculus is concerned with areas and volumes. Areas and volumes. 18 Forward Principles of Natural Philosophy, first published in 1687, thus implying that physics, as natural philosophy, is part of a broader philosophical project. My philosophical research, which has earned me a doctoral degree in Christian philosophy from the Academia Teológica de San Andrés de Mexico, which is part of the Ukrainian Christian Orthodox Church of Mexico under Metropolitan Daniel de Jesus Ruiz Flores, includes a combination of ontology and theology, and it underpins my philosophical approach to religion. Thus, I have never looked for a formalistic religion to put all my spiritual awareness into, but I understand religion as a personal, mystical bond with the person, with capital P, who underpins my own personhood and is the transcendent end of my personhood. Having said that, I wish to add that, far from despising doctrinal theology, I aim at restoring doctrinal theology to its original authoritative position as the custodian of the following two existential underpinnings of humanity. Firstly, the understanding of God as the embodiment of love, according to Hosea 3 verses 1 to 5, 1 John 4 verse 16, and 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 to 7, and, secondly, the sensitivity to and the pursuit of the real truth, namely, an ontologically grounded truth that is accessible to the human being and endows the human individual with universality. On the other hand, literarily poor thrillers and debased conspiracy theory and mystery books profane humanity's great spiritual traditions and disorientate people. For instance, both the huge commercial success of Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code, published in 2003 by Doubleday in the USA and by Transworld and Bantam Books in the UK, and the large number of the people who took it literally not as fiction, but as if it were a real revelation are noteworthy phenomena. In fact, from the perspective of a serious esotericist and a scholarly rigorous student of cultural anthropology and spirituality, the hordes of those tourists who